The Battle of Stalingrad had been raging since July 1942, and throughout this time the Germans had held the initiative. They had raced towards the Don, then over it, and into Stalingrad, with Paulus picking his fights and launching his offensives. It was down to Chuikov and the Soviets to react to the German attacks, which they had done at the cost of horrendous casualties. But it was now November, and Paulus' 6th Army had been reduced to fighting for entire days just for individual houses inside the ruined city, indicated here. Now though, we're going to focus on this entire region once more, as the Soviets prepared their great counter-offensive of 1942, Operation Uranus. The idea was to smash through the Romanian lines on the flanks of the 6th Army, then race for Kalach and encircle the Germans in a giant pocket at Stalingrad. For the first time, the Soviets would hold the initiative in this campaign. Paulus would no longer be picking his battles, and the Soviets would be forcing him to react for a change. 3 Soviet fronts would take part in Operation Uranus: Vatutin's Southwestern Front, Rokossovsky's Don Front, and Yeremenko's Stalingrad Front. The strongest of these was Vatutin's Southwestern Front, which would attack from hard-won bridgeheads south of the Don River. Vatutin had the 5th Tank Army and the 21st Army ready to go, supported by the 17th Air Army and parts of the 2nd Air Army. The 1st Guards Army was also in reserve. Romanienko's 5th Tank Army had 7 rifle divisions, 2 tank corps, 1 cavalry corps, a separate tank brigade, and a bunch of additional support units. The main ones we need to take note of now are Butkov's 1st Tank Corps, Rodin's 26th Tank Corps, and Borisov's 8th Cavalry Corps. And Chistikov's 21st Army also had 6 rifle divisions, but only 1 tank and 1 cavalry corps. The main 2 units of this army were Kravchenko's 4th Tank Corps, which we've seen before, they had fought during Falblau and the Kotlebane offensives, and Plev's 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps. Finally, there was Lidyshenko's 1st Guards Army, sat in reserve for now. The reason it was in reserve was because the Stavka hoped to use it for its future offensive plan, Operation Saturn. You see, there was a constellation of offensives planned in the winter of 1942. Operation Mars at Rzhev near Moscow, Operation Uranus at Stalingrad, and Operation Saturn, designed to strike towards Rostov and trap Army Group A in the Caucasus. So the Stavka didn't really want to use the 1st Guards Army for Operation Uranus, but could use it if things didn't go well. Thus, Vatutin's front had a total ration strength of 389,902 men, with a combat strength of 331,984 men. They were supported by 8,655 guns and mortars, 721 tanks, and 359 combat aircraft, 311 of which were operational. It's no wonder the Stavka was confident that the Southwestern Front's forces were sufficient to strike and decisively defeat the 6 weak divisions of Romanian Third Army opposite it. And they should have been. Dumitrescu's Romanian Third Army had a ration strength of 155,492 men and a combat strength of around 100,000 men. Yeah, they were outnumbered by roughly 3 to 1. They also defended a 160km front with 4 army corps, each controlling 2 divisions with 7 battalions in each, meaning that their already weak divisions were stretched over too large of a front. It was recommended that a Romanian division could occupy a 10km line. Well, the Romanian divisions here had frontages averaging double that, 20 kilometers. This meant that almost every battalion was deployed on the front line, with only some in reserve. They did have the Romanian 15th Infantry Division at Gromki, the Romanian 7th Cavalry Division at Pronin, without most of its horses, and the Romanian 1st Armoured Division nearby too, but the latter only had a total of 105 operational tanks, most of them Skoda R2s, which were basically Czechoslovakian light tanks. They had more of these tanks sat in workshops in the rear because 12 had broken down on the way from the train station to the front, which should give you an indication of how reliable these tanks were. Their 37.2mm main cannons, which were lighter in calibre than the British 2-pounders, were found to be completely ineffective against the T-34s. This was why the Germans had given them some Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs to boost their strength. However, the Panzer IIIs they received only had short-barreled 75mm guns, and so these were infantry support tanks, not tank killers. There was a huge ammunition shortage, and their anti-tank companies were armed with either Böhler 47mm or Bofors 37mm guns, the latter having been bought from Germany, who had captured them from Poland. And throughout the war, Romanian divisional artillery remained equipped with older, lighter pieces than the Germans or Soviets, and even when armour-piercing rounds were introduced from 1942, their low muzzle velocity did not give them comparable anti-tank potential. Thus, a Romanian infantry division could fire well under half the weight of shell of the similarly sized German infantry division and could usually only fire about the same weight of shell as the smaller Soviet infantry division. Furthermore, it was consistently outranged by both. The Germans had provided some converted French 75mm anti-tank guns to the Romanians in October 1942, but only 60, which was 6 per division, or 1 for every 2.5 kilometers of front. Worse, Romanian field artillery had no anti-tank ammunition, and the army possessed only about 1/6 of its requested anti-tank mines. It had little in the way of obstacle construction materials. Given the approaching winter on the open steppes, any construction efforts along this defensive front tended to focus on warm shelters rather than defensive fortifications. These shelters were also many miles below the Don, depriving the Romanians of the protection of the river, a natural anti-tank defence, and also meant that the Soviets could build up their forces inside the bridgeheads rather than having to fight to cross them first. Dumitrescu had previously asked for support so that he could recapture the lost ground and re-establish his line on the Don, saying that only the river could give his army the necessary tank protection. Even though von Weichs agreed, he didn't give him the necessary reinforcements. However, the Germans did understand the problem and moved some reinforcements behind the Romanians. They sent Group Simon, which was basically a reinforced infantry battalion, and also, of course, Heim's 48th Panzer Corps with Ruhrt's 22nd Panzer Division, itself not even at full strength since it had sent its engineer battalion to Stalingrad and its 140th Panzer Grenadier Regiment to Voronezh. Those elements of the division that were allocated to the Romanian sector had been sat doing nothing for weeks thanks to fuel shortages, and they had covered their tanks with straw to protect them from the cold. So when they attempted to start their engines, the panzer crews found that mice had chewed the wiring. As a result, many of the panzers hadn't actually reached this area. Just 42 of the 104 they were supposed to have had arrived, with only 30 being operational on the eve of Operation Uranus. Where are the tanks that were eaten up by mice back then? They were up there with the 22nd Panzer Division. Some sources suggest that the 22nd Panzer Division was armed with Czechoslovakian tanks, and while it did originally field Panzer 38T Czech tanks earlier in the war, it's likely that all of these had been lost by November 1942. It appears that the only reason historians are saying that it had Czech tanks is because General Heim said after the war that the division still had 5 Panzer 38Ts in operation on the 19th of November. They're taking Heim at his word though, because the other primary sources don't say that they had Czech tanks, although that doesn't mean that they didn't have Czech tanks, because the Germans may have neglected to report their existence, which they did in other cases. Either way, 22nd Panzer Division wasn't really a division, it was just a reinforced regiment-sized Kampfgruppe when Operation Uranus began, and wasn't prepared for the nightmare it was about to face. Yes, the 14th Panzer Division's panzer elements were on their way, but even they only had 55 panzers in total, of which just 40 were operational. So basically the Romanians were practically on their own. To the south of Stalingrad, Yeremenko's Stalingrad front had gathered forces to strike for Kalach. Yeremenko had 4 armies, the 64th, 57th, 51st and 28th Armies, while Churykov's 62nd Army, or what was left of it, would conduct an active defence to pin down as many German forces as possible in the city. Shumilov's 64th Army was weak, having been fighting to retain its bridgehead at Bikitovka, and even though Shumilov had recently received reinforcements, his army could hardly be expected to play a large role in the upcoming offensive. It would, however, strike with its left flank with 3 divisions supported by 2 tank brigades against 1 Romanian division and part of a German division. Tolbukin's 57th Army and Trofanov's 51st Army, however, were the strongest of Yeremenko's armies with over 200 tanks each, so they were chosen to be the main driving force of the southern pincer. Tolbukin's 57th Army had Tanishchin's 13th Tank Corps, a veteran formation of the Stalingrad campaign, and Trofanov's 51st Army had Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps, which had roughly 20,000 men and 200 tanks prior to Uranus, and Shapkin's 4th Cavalry Corps, which would also be important, even though it only had 2 divisions at this time. Further south, Gerasimenko's 28th Army, with 2 rifle divisions, 3 rifle brigades, 1 tank brigade, an extra tank battalion, an armoured train battalion, and a bunch of extra units, only faced the German 16th Motorised Division, which was defending a large region east of Elista. While not stated in the books, I suspect that logistics played a major role in this area for both sides, since neither of them placed many units south of Stalingrad. You'd think the Soviets would strike hard into the unprotected flank where just 1 German division was stationed, and yet the 28th Army wasn't given many units. It's probably because they couldn't support many units in the area, and the same logic applies to the Bikitovka and Lake regions. Yes, the Soviets outnumbered the Germans and Romanians, but you'd think they'd use a lot more guys than they actually did here. So to me, this is a clear indication that they were hindered by logistics. Anyway, Yeremenko had a total force of 367,943 men, of which 258,317 men were frontline soldiers, supported by 6,739 guns and mortars, 575 tanks, and 782 combat aircraft, 637 of which were operational. Now, this might seem like a weak force, especially compared to Vatutin's Southwestern Front, but they were only facing a handful of weak German and Romanian divisions, a significant portion of which were just basically out for their counts inside the city of Stalingrad, so Yeremenko's forces didn't have to be super strong to achieve their breakthrough. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army was a panzer army in name only, since it had no panzer divisions. It did have 2 motorised divisions with some panzers in them, the 16th and 29th, but while the 16th Motorised Division had as many as 15,000 men and 43 panzers, many of the men came from Turkestan Auxiliary Volunteer Battalions, and were not Germans. It was also guarding the eastern flank of Army Group B in the Elista region, a sector that was 300 kilometers long and couldn't be pulled out of there. The 29th Motorised Division was, however, in reserve and was the best equipped division that the Germans had in the entire Stalingrad region, with 12,000 men and 59 panzers. However, Hoth's forces were also deployed too thin for the 180-kilometre area they were trying to defend. Hoth's Romanian divisions, with a ration strength of 75,318 men, actually had frontages 50% longer than the Romanian formations defending along the Don, and only 34 of the French 75mm anti-tank guns had been given to the Romanians here. By the 19th of November, the Romanians in Hoth's army were living half-starved and inadequately clothed in canvas-covered pits in temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius. Morale was therefore extremely low. Finally, we have to mention Rokossovsky's Don front, which was the weakest of the 3 fronts due to the fact that it had headbutted the German positions over and over in the previous months until it was exhausted. It was also only expected to play a minor role in Operation Uranus, which was to pin down as many German formations as possible and support Vatutin's Southwestern Front. Its 3 armies were also expected to fight the Germans rather than the Romanians like the other 2 fronts, which had proven to be costly so far. In total then, Rokossovski had a ration strength of 284,373 men, his combat strength was 192,193 men, backed by 6,625 guns and mortars, 254 tanks, and 388 combat aircraft, 329 of which were operational. And Paulus' 6th Army was weaker than Rokossovski's weak front, with a combat strength of 175,776 men. Paulus was authorised to have 297,676 men, so there was a personnel shortage of 121,900 men in his army, which was only at 59% of its strength in mid-November. While his army should have had 139 infantry battalions, it actually had 96, and many of them weren't anywhere near full strength. In total, he had about 218 panzers, of which 180 were operational, with some being Panzer IIs or command panzers. So, effectively, Paulus had one panzer division's worth of strength, with an additional 68 stugs, of which only 43 were operational. Paulus also had no reserves at all, since the 36th Panzer Regiment had been sent west to help the Romanians, and there were also ammunition and fuel shortages in the 6th Army. So, overall, having ground itself into dust outside and then inside the city of Stalingrad over the past 6 months, the 6th Army was terribly weak, to the point that it was barely able to take 1 or 2 houses per day in the city. But to be fair, Paulus wasn't the main focus of the attack. It was the Romanians at the Don and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army that would take the brunt of it. And Paulus had veteran German formations that had proven themselves more than capable in the defence. So really, Paulus wouldn't have to worry too much about facing Rokossovski's front. The issue was that if the Romanian lines couldn't hold, he would find himself threatened with encirclement, and had nothing to plug the gap with. For the whole of Operation Uranus then, the Soviet ration strength was 1,042,218 men, with a combat strength of 782,548 men. They had 22,019 guns and mortars, 1,550 tanks, and 1,529 combat aircraft, 1,277 of which were operational. German and Romanian numbers come to roughly 241,987 German and Croatian soldiers, 230,872 Romanian soldiers, 436 panzers, 68 stugs, and 89 Romanian tanks. That's a total of 472,859 men, or less than half of the Soviet numbers, and 590 armoured combat vehicles, or about a third of the Soviet tank number. While Soviet sources say that Luftwaffe 4 had 1,216 aircraft, including Romanian and transport aircraft, the reality was that they only had 732 combat aircraft, and only 402 of these were operational. And clearly, since the bulk of these numbers would be falling on Romanian divisions, the Axis were at a severe disadvantage in both raw numbers and also the quality of their equipment. The question is, were the Soviets capable of turning that advantage into a victory, or would they throw it away like they had done so many times before? Let's find out. It snowed on the night of the 18th to the 19th of November 1942, with the temperature falling to -7 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Early morning fog obscured Romanian sentries and allowed the Soviet engineers time to clear the minefields along the Don River front unhindered. Most aircraft on both sides were also grounded, so neither side would receive support from the air. Because the Soviets had conducted reconnaissance operations against the Romanian lines for several days, the Romanian forward security forces were forced back to their main defensive positions, which on the one hand meant that Romanenko's army was right up against the Romanian divisions when Operation Uranus kicked off, but also meant that the Axis were not surprised when the Soviet artillery barrage started at 0730 hours on the 19th of November 1942. Over 3,500 guns, mortars and rocket launchers fired for over 80 minutes, allowing rifle battalions supported by sappers and tanks to move up to the Romanian defences and remove mines and barbed wire. The bombardment was so intense that 30 miles to the south, medical officers in the 22nd Panzer Division were woken from a heavy sleep because the ground trembled. At 0850 hours, the riflemen from the 5th Tank, 21st and 65th Armies attacked. They did have some tank support, but the infantry did the bulk of the work. Still, the Romanians at the front had neither tanks nor adequate anti-tank weaponry, and so these few tanks were devastating. The Romanians defended their trenches as best as they could, but their forward positions were overwhelmed within the first hour, and Balov's 50th Guards Division tore through the Romanian 5th Infantry Division's left wing. The Romanian 14th Infantry Division was also overwhelmed and forced back by the 119th Rifle and the 47th Guards Rifle Divisions, the latter backed by the 8th Guards Tank Brigade and the 511th Tank Battalion. A promising start, but not everything went to plan. Griznov's 14th Guards Rifle Division didn't have any tanks and barely went anywhere. The Romanian 9th Infantry Division responded with artillery, mortar and machine gun fire from a nearby hill, all of which had seemingly withstood the artillery bombardment. In 21st Army sector, Isakov's 96th Rifle Division was stopped dead in its tracks by the Romanian 6th Infantry Division, with the Soviets beaten back to their jumping off positions by a Romanian counterattack. Kozin's 63rd Rifle Division also only advanced about a kilometre before it was stopped by heavy fire from the Romanian 13th Infantry Division. However, the other units of 21st Army did better. A 90-man strong band played their music as the 76th Rifle Division carved a 3-kilometre wedge between the 13th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions, along with Glebov's 27th Guards Rifle Division from the 65th Army, and the 293rd Rifle Division advanced 4 kilometres as well. Of course, Batov's army had to attack both Romanian and German positions, and therefore struggled, especially with the latter, since the 376th Infantry Division was quickly reinforced by the 14th Panzer Division's Panzerkampfgruppe. The Romanian Third Army HQ informed Army Group B about what was happening, and Weichs passed the news up to Zeitzler, asking permission to halt ongoing operations in Stalingrad so he could concentrate on the Don. Zeitzler got on the phone to Hitler, while General Heim asked Weichs if he could send his panzers northeast towards the Kletskaya region, requesting that he also be given the 1st Romanian Armoured Division to command as well. They, with the 7th Cavalry Division, could defeat the Soviet tank formation south of Kletskaya, Heim said, and prevent the Soviets from splitting the Romanians from the Germans. Now, there's a contradiction in the sources, with some saying that Zeitzler persuaded Hitler, who was at Berchtesgaden, to place Heim's Panzer Corps in Army Group B's hands. Von Weichs and Soderstern, Army Group B's Chief of Staff, both agreed with Heim, and Heim began moving the 48th Panzer Corps at 10:30 hours. But then Heim's orders were soon changed because Army Group B realised that the main threat wasn't from Kletskaya, but was further to the west, and so Heim turned in that direction. Other sources say, and this has got to be the most ridiculous Madman Hitler claim I've ever come across, other sources say that Hitler was the one who changed the order, and that Heim had to slam on the brakes and turn almost 180 degrees before heading in the opposite direction, and that this was a mistake. The implication being that Madman Hitler shouldn't have intervened because Heim was originally headed in the right direction. Except Heim wasn't headed in the right direction, and so Hitler's order put him where he needed to be. So Hitler's being blamed for a mistake which wasn't even a mistake. Worse, if Heim had been allowed to carry on going where he was going, the 22nd Panzer Division would have ended up in the Stalingrad pocket as well, making the disaster slightly worse. So this wasn't the wrong decision, this wasn't a Madman Hitler moment, even though people are trying to spin it as if it was, And it's clear that Zeitzler influenced Hitler's decision, and that Army Group B probably agreed to the change as well, or even made it themselves, as the situation was becoming increasingly clear as the morning progressed. Anyway, Heim's change of direction was bad news for the Soviets, but especially so because by 1100 hours they had only advanced about 3 kilometers. According to the plan, they should have gone at least 15 kilometers by this point, so they were massively behind schedule. It was clear that the Soviet artillery hadn't been as effective as had been hoped, that Romanian resistance had been far tougher than expected, and that the weather had hindered Soviet Air Force operations over the Romanian lines. The ground had also turned to mud as the temperature rose during the morning, causing delays, and Operation Uranus was faltering. So, I want to emphasise this. The Romanians did resist at first and did hold most of the line against the Soviet infantry. It wasn't as if they all just collapsed, as some of the accounts make it seem like they did. I'm especially looking at you, Werner Habt. No, the Romanian corps didn't just all scatter immediately. They only collapsed in the face of the Soviet tanks, something that the Romanians had no answer for. So, since the infantry attacks weren't working, Romanienko and Chistiakov decided to send in their main tank forces, which should only have been used as exploitation forces after the infantry had created a gap, which they hadn't. Vatutin agreed to the change of plan, and at 1200 hours, Butkov's 1st and Rodin's 26th Tank Corps began moving south to prepare to mount a breakthrough attack. At the same time, the 22nd Panzer Division started moving north, with the 1st Romanian Armoured Division behind them. Well, at 1250 hours, the 2 Soviet Tank Corps were ready, and at 1400 hours they rolled south. Surprisingly, this wall of armour, 22 kilometers wide, was actually stopped by the Romanians at first, with the 14th and 5th Romanian Divisions holding their own against Rodin's 26th Tank Corps. But when Rodin shifted some of his forces to the west and around the 5th Infantry Division, his tanks slammed into the Romanian 14th Infantry Division along with all 3 brigades of Butkov's Corps too. And the Romanians had no answer to this. 180 tanks, backed by a ton of Soviet infantry, shattered their lines, and the survivors simply fled. The tank fright, as it has been called, caused the evaporation of the Romanian formations. Some units were surrounded, other strongpoints fell rapidly. Belik's 8th Motorcycle Regiment, having followed Butkov's tanks through the gap, now sped off and ran into Romanian infantry and cavalry. Butkov had advanced 18 kilometers and Rodin wasn't far behind him. It's worth pointing out that they might have gone further had the fog and mist not obscured visibility, to the point that some Soviet tank commanders had to steer their units using a compass. Snow also impeded their drive, bogging their vehicles down and blocking their vision slits, blinding them and making the going hazardous. So the kilometers they did cover were actually impressive in the circumstances. Further east, Chistiakov sent the 4th Tank and 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps into battle. At 1300 hours, Kravchenko's tanks moved through the 293rd Rifle Division and drove over the 13th Romanian Division. The Romanian divisional headquarters was overrun and the tanks darted south, bypassing all resistance, including that of the Romanian 15th Infantry Division, which was redeploying to the area. They began to seize crossings over the Kirtlac River by about 1600 hours. One battalion on the right wing tried to move further west, but ran into resistance from the Romanian 15th Infantry Division and lost 8 out of its 15 tanks, proving that the Romanians were putting up a fight. Nonetheless, the left wing pushed south of the Kirtlac River and continued the advance overnight. One Romanian 75mm field artillery battery had the unnerving experience of watching its supposedly armoured piercing shells bounce off one Soviet tank at only 5 meters range. Meanwhile, the 1st Romanian Armoured Division, which had been heading towards Kletskaya, reacted to events. It turned and headed towards the 14th Infantry Division's crumbling lines. The Romanian 7th Cavalry Division was also counterattacking towards Blinovsky, and the 47th Guards Rifle Division did its best to halt it. Borisov's 8th Cavalry Corps was also galloping up, and Chelenka's 55th Cavalry Division supported the 47th Guards Rifle Division in this fight. Then, at 1600 hours, the reconnaissance battalion and some anti-tank guns of Colonel Rourt's 22nd Panzer Division encountered a strong force of Soviet tanks, and a battle began. The problem, of course, was that Kravchenko's force was now split into two, with its left column lagging behind by 20 kilometers. So, while the Romanian lines had been smashed, the Axis forces had reacted, and it was looking like the attack could be defeated by the tank and cavalry reinforcements sent to the area. And Rodin had not kept up with Batov's tanks thanks to significant resistance from the 14th and 5th Romanian divisions. Thus, the Soviets in this area were off balance. Of course, the Axis were in a lot of trouble. Rourt was unable to coordinate his actions with the Romanian 1st Armoured Division because the 26th Tank Corps had struck the Romanian Armoured Division's headquarters, destroying the liaison officer's radio in the process. As the two sides ran into each other, Heim received the order from Army Group B that he was to fight a delaying action before withdrawing south. It seems that the Germans knew that they couldn't hold on with such a meagre force. So how would Army Group B react to what was happening? Would Paulus send more troops, or did he not react at all? Let's find out. At 1700 hours, Colonel Adams supposedly suggested to Paulus that they withdraw the 6th Army to the southwest. But Paulus refused, knowing that it would go against the Führer's wishes. To me though, this account rings hollow, as do other accounts that say Paulus didn't react to the day's events. Yes, he did, he sent units west, but also, isn't withdrawing the entire army a little bit of an overreaction at this stage? Would a full withdrawal of all these units be appropriate just because of a crisis on their flank? Imagine if they did withdraw and then the gaps were plugged. They would have abandoned everything they had gained over the past few months for basically nothing. On the first day, there was no major threat to the 6th Army, and this is why I don't believe some of these German accounts. Adam here seems to be speaking with the benefit of hindsight because at the time there's no way they would decide to abandon Stalingrad. Maybe a little later, but not now. And we actually have evidence supporting this conclusion. Anthony Beaver is one of the historians with the opinion that Paulus was wrong for not reacting, yet then provides the evidence that the German commanders didn't know what the Soviet plan was. So how are they meant to react if they don't know what the Soviets are up to? In the afternoon of this first day, Richthofen wrote in his diary that the Soviets were just heading to the railway lines to cut off 6th Army's supplies. Anthony Beaver states he wasn't the only one with this view, but there's no mention of encirclement, and Colonel Adam himself also says, as yet we did not know enough about the enemy's intentions and direction of attack. Yet he was perfectly willing to abandon Stalingrad at this juncture. Fritz also confirms that Paulus didn't know what was happening until the evening of the first day when von Weichs called him, and the German official history says that Paulus didn't believe that there was an immediate threat to his army. So, rather than the idea that everyone saw the obvious signs of impending doom and that Paulus was just blindly following Hitler's orders, the reality on the ground was that there was no reason to overreact at this point. Maybe later, but not now. Instead, Paulus and his staff discussed various options, and Schmidt, his chief of staff, suggested that the 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions should join with the 14th Panzer Division and strike the flank of the Soviet force. More forces would then be sent to cover the rear flank of the army and secure their lines of communication. All of this would also allow the army to escape in the event that they did abandon Stalingrad. So, with this being a much more reasonable idea compared to what Colonel Adams supposedly suggested, if he suggested it at all, Paulus approved of this plan. It was only at 21:30 hours, when von Weichs explained the situation to the 6th Army, that the 6th Army really grasped what was going on. Weichs ordered Paulus to stop his attacks in Stalingrad and send his panzer divisions west, along with another infantry division and other anti-tank forces. The 14th Panzer Corps was ordered to disengage from the city fight, and several units were already preparing to move thanks to Paulus's reaction. Schwerin's 79th Infantry Division's assaults against the Red October factory were cancelled at 22:45 hours, and the division started moving forces west. In addition, the 354th Grenadier Regiment from the 403rd Security Division was ordered to move north from the Morozovsky region to the rail line along the Cher River. And the only evacuations taking place were those of Luftflotte 4, whose commander now ordered his planes to get out of the area behind the 3rd Romanian Army so that they didn't fall into enemy hands. The problem was that the weather might prevent such a movement, so whether they escaped or not would be down to the heavens. Despite the weather though, German planes had actually destroyed 11 of the 12 pontoon bridges over the Don in Plev's sector, so only the 5th and 6th Guards Cavalry Divisions had actually crossed so far. Nonetheless, they reached the Vlasov area by the late evening, with the 5th Guards Cavalry Division getting embroiled in the fight with the Romanian 15th Division. Losses for the Soviets were not too bad. Kravchenko's 4th Tank Corps had lost 5 KVs, 19 T-34s and 3 T-70s on this first day, while 1st Tank Corps lost 49 tanks and the 26th Tank Corps lost another 46. Isayev notes that the Soviet tank forces took higher losses than necessary because they had to be committed earlier than planned to break through the Romanian lines, which the infantry should have done for them. And while I don't have the numbers for all the formations, it's clear that some of the Soviet rifle divisions suffered only minor losses. Of course, Romanian losses were significant, although there's no hard numbers for the first day. Still, the collapse of Romanian forces has caused some authors to conclude that the Romanians were all cowards. One Stuka pilot flying over the front later wrote, "Masses in brown uniforms. Are they Russians? No, Romanians. Some of them are even throwing their rifles in order to be able to run faster. A shocking sight. We find all the Romanian positions in front of them deserted. We attack with bombs and gunfire, but what use is that when there is no resistance on the ground? On the return flight, we again observe the fleeing Romanians. It is a good thing for them that I have run out of ammunition to stop this cowardly rout. They have abandoned everything, their easily defended positions, their heavy artillery, their ammunition dumps. Their cowardice is certain to cause a debacle along the whole front." Considering that visibility was so poor due to the blizzards and the fog that Soviet tank drivers were using compasses to guide them, it's surprising that Ulrich could see anything at all. We also have reports from Soviet pilots saying that the fog was so thick that the only thing that they could see below was the odd flash of fire through the veil. So for Ulrich to see the Romanians running away and throwing their weapons to the ground, he must have been eating a lot of carrots. Also, Ulrich remained a Nazi after the war when he wrote his memoirs, and so his views are coloured by his blatant racism. But he's not the only one to come to this conclusion, so it's worth clarifying this. No, the Romanians didn't just flee. They stood their ground at first, but were simply overwhelmed. And some of the units didn't even flee at all. Plus, the reason why any of the Romanians fled was because they had no answer whatsoever to the Soviet tanks. It's not because they were a cowardly race or anything like that, it's simply because their anti-tank guns weren't good enough, plus the fact that they were stretched too thin and were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And a lot of the blame for this rests with the members of the supposed Aryan race, who put the Romanians in this position in the first place. If Hitler hadn't gone to war, If Hitler hadn't stretched his forces too thin, and if Hitler hadn't been forced to rely on Axis allied troops whom he gave practically no support and just a few obsolete French anti-tank guns that weren't capable of stopping the T-34s with the ammunition that the Germans provided, then maybe the Romanians wouldn't have fled at all. And, surprisingly, Soviet authors later came to the conclusion that the first day of Operation Uranus hadn't been that successful. The tanks should have gone many miles further than they had gone, according to the plan. Virtually all Soviet critiques of Uranus acknowledge that Vatutin's Southwestern Front failed to accomplish its assigned missions on 19th of November, and in fact fell well short of fulfilling the demanding requirements of the Stavka's plan. Although 5th Tank and 21st Armies managed to tear large holes through Romanian Third Army's forward defences, only 21st Army was able to project mobile forces into the operational depths. These exploitation forces amounted to just 2 of 4th Tank Corps' 3 tank brigades. Based on past experience, this force would have become cannon fodder for the Germans if they could have generated panzer reserves of their own. Well, part of the reason why Chistikov's 21st Army had done so poorly was because the Germans and Romanians had assumed that the Kletskaya region was the main area of attack. That's why Heim had aimed to send his troops there at first, before turning to face the 5th Tank Army, which was the actual focus of the attack. Now, whether Heim should have gone to Kletskaya or not is up for debate, although it makes sense to send them to the main area. But what is clear is that Heim was forced to make this choice because there simply weren't enough reserves to plug both gaps. There were barely any panzers in the area, and Heim's corps was woefully inadequate to meet the 5th Tank Army on its own, never mind the 21st Army as well. He had, however, started to disrupt the 5th Tank Corps' attack along with the Romanians. So could he stall them long enough for reinforcements to arrive? Could the Romanians pull back and form another line further south? Or would the Soviets find a way through the Axis lines and race towards Kalach? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.